There is a moment that every betrayed wife knows intimately, that split second when the veil falls away, and you see the person you married for exactly who they really are. And for me, that moment came while standing in the rain outside the restaurant my father built with his bare hands, watching my husband change the locks, while his mother smiled at me through the window. My name is Sophia, I am 38 years old, and 4 years ago I lost everything I had ever loved to the family I had trusted with my entire heart. My father's restaurant empire, 9 locations across 3 states generating nearly $10 million in annual revenue, was stolen from me through a systematic campaign of fraud, manipulation, and cruelty that I never saw coming. My husband of 7 years, a man named Marcus who I believed loved me more than life itself, was the architect of my destruction, and his family, the people I had welcomed into my life and treated as my own blood, were his willing accomplices. But they made a critical error in their calculations. They assumed that grief would make me weak. They assumed that a woman who had just lost her father would be too broken to fight back. They assumed I would disappear quietly and let them enjoy the fortune they had stolen. They were catastrophically wrong. I need to start at the beginning so you understand how deep this betrayal went and why my revenge was not just justified but necessary for my very survival. My father was a man named Antonio Reyes, an immigrant from Mexico who came to this country with nothing but $20 in his pocket and a dream of building something better for his family. He arrived in Phoenix in 1978, barely speaking English, knowing no one, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination that bordered on obsession. He used to tell me stories about those early days, sleeping in bus stations, working 3 jobs at once, saving every penny while other immigrants around him spent their meager earnings on small comforts. He wasn't interested in comfort. He was interested in building something that would last. He worked in restaurant kitchens for 15 years, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. He started as a dishwasher, scrubbing pots in a steaming kitchen for minimum wage, and worked his way up to line cook, then prep chef, then sous chef. He learned American tastes while never forgetting his roots, studying how to blend the flavors of his homeland with the preferences of his adopted country. He watched how restaurants succeeded and how they failed, taking mental notes on everything from portion sizes to customer service to the importance of consistent quality. By the time he was ready to strike out on his own, he had accumulated more practical knowledge than most business school graduates could ever hope to acquire. He met my mother, Maria, at a church festival in 1985. She was the daughter of another immigrant family, beautiful and practical, and possessed of a work ethic that matched his own. They were married within a year, and I was born the year after that, in a tiny apartment above a dry cleaner's shop where the smell of chemicals seeped through the floorboards every night. I don't remember much about those early years, but I remember the feeling of safety, of being loved unconditionally, of watching my parents work side by side with a partnership that seemed almost magical to my young eyes. They were a team in every sense of the word, and they were building something together that would change all of our lives. My father finally saved enough to open his own place in 1992 when I was 5 years old. It was a small taqueria in a strip mall in South Phoenix, wedged between a laundromat and a check cashing place in a neighborhood that most people drove through without stopping. The location was terrible, but the rent was cheap, and my father saw potential where others saw only risk. He called it Casa Reyes, a name that proclaimed ownership and pride in a country that often made immigrants feel like guests who had overstayed their welcome. My mother worked the register while my father cooked, and I grew up running between tables, learning the business from the ground up just as my father had done years before. Those early years were difficult in ways I only fully understood later. There were months when my parents couldn't pay themselves, when every dollar went back into the business, when we ate leftover rice and beans for dinner because that's what the restaurant had available. There were nights when I heard my mother crying softly in the kitchen, worried about bills and rent and whether the dream was worth the sacrifice, but my father never wavered. He believed in what he was building with a faith that bordered on religious conviction, and slowly, painfully, the business began to grow. Regulars started appearing, then more regulars, then people who drove across town specifically to taste my father's food. Word of mouth spread, reviews appeared in local publications, and by the time I was 10 years old, we had moved out of that tiny apartment and into a real house with a backyard and a room of my own. The expansion began when I was 12. My father opened a second location, larger and in a better neighborhood, using the profits from the original restaurant and a small business loan that he paid off in half the time the bank expected. Then came a third location, and a fourth, each one building on the success of the ones before. My father was methodical in his growth, never overextending, always ensuring that quality remained consistent across every restaurant. He developed systems and processes that could be replicated, training manuals that ensured every employee understood exactly how things should be done. He was building not just a business but an institution, something that would outlast him and provide for his family for generations to come. My mother's death when I was 23 was the first great tragedy of my adult life. She had been feeling tired for months, dismissing it as stress and overwork, refusing to see a doctor because there was always something more important to do. By the time she finally went for a checkup, the cancer had spread throughout her body, and there was nothing anyone could do. She died 6 weeks after the diagnosis, surrounded by family, holding my father's hand until the very end. I watched something break in him that day, a light going out behind his eyes that never fully returned. He kept working, kept building, kept pushing forward, but the joy was gone. Everything he did after that was in memory of her, a tribute to the woman who had stood beside him through every struggle and every triumph. After my mother's death, I became my father's primary companion and confidant. I had gone to culinary school, gotten a business degree, and joined the family company as his partner and eventual successor. We worked together every day, developing new recipes, planning expansions, solving problems as they arose. He taught me everything he knew, not just about cooking and business, but about life, about integrity, about the importance of treating people fairly even when the world treated you unfairly. He was more than my father during those years. He was my mentor, my best friend, and the person I admired most in the entire world. I would have done anything for him, and I believed he would live forever, stubborn and strong and utterly invincible. I met Marcus at a charity event when I was 29 years old, a fundraiser for a local children's hospital that Casa Reyes had sponsored. He was charming, handsome, and seemed genuinely interested in me as a person, rather than just the heir to a restaurant empire. He had dark hair, blue eyes, and a smile that made me feel like the most important person in any room. He worked in real estate, had his own small firm, and came from what he described as a close-knit family that I found immediately appealing given how small my own family had become after my mother's death. He asked questions about my work, my passions, my dreams for the future, and actually listened to the answers instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. I was smitten from the first conversation, and by the end of the night, I had given him my phone number without hesitation. Our courtship was everything I had ever dreamed of. Marcus was attentive, romantic, and seemed to understand intuitively what I needed at any given moment. He brought me flowers for no reason, planned surprise weekend getaways, and remembered every small detail I mentioned about my life and preferences. He met my father and impressed him immediately, asking intelligent questions about the business and showing genuine respect for what my father had built. My father, who was usually suspicious of anyone who showed romantic interest in me, gave Marcus his approval within weeks. "He's a good man, Mija," my father told me after their first meeting. "He sees you for who you are, not for what you have. Hold on to him." Marcus's family welcomed me with open arms from the very beginning. His mother, Alina, was warm and nurturing, always inviting me to family dinners and treating me like a daughter from the very first day. She reminded me of my own mother in some ways, with her easy laugh and her insistence on feeding everyone who walked through her door. His father, Roberto, was quieter but equally kind, a retired accountant who spent most of his time in his workshop, building furniture and occasionally offering gentle wisdom when it was needed. And Marcus's two younger brothers, Miguel and Carlos, quickly became the siblings I had never had. Miguel was the middle child, ambitious and energetic, always talking about his latest business idea. Carlos was the baby of the family, laid back and easygoing, content to follow wherever his older brothers led. Together, they formed a unit that seemed impossibly perfect, a family that laughed and argued and supported each other through everything. I wanted desperately to be part of it. When Marcus proposed after 2 years of dating, I said yes without hesitation. He did it on the anniversary of our first meeting, at the same charity event where we had met, getting down on one knee in front of hundreds of people, and producing a ring that must have cost him 3 months' salary. I cried, he cried, and when I looked over at my father, he was crying too, his weathered face shining with tears of joy for his daughter's happiness. The engagement was everything I had hoped for, and the wedding that followed was even better. We held it at the original Casa Reyes location, the tiny taqueria where my father's dream had begun, transformed for one night into a magical wonderland of flowers and lights and love. My father gave a speech that night that still brings tears to my eyes when I think about it. He talked about how happy he was that I had found someone who loved me, how proud he was of the woman I had become, and how confident he was that Marcus would take care of me when he was gone. That last part hits different now, knowing what I know. For the first 3 years of my marriage, everything seemed perfect. Marcus was the husband I had always dreamed of, attentive and supportive, and seemingly devoted to my happiness. He offered to help with the family business, attending meetings and reviewing financial statements, and making suggestions that sometimes proved valuable. My father appreciated his involvement, grateful to have another person who cared about the company's success. I appreciated having a partner who understood the demands of running a business and didn't resent the long hours I often had to work. We were happy, or at least I was happy, believing that our life together was everything I had hoped it would be. Marcus's family became increasingly integrated into our lives during those years. Elena started helping with catering for special events, using her own recipes alongside ours. Roberto offered to look over the books, bringing his accounting experience to bear on our increasingly complex finances. Miguel expressed interest in learning the restaurant business and was given a management position at one of the locations. Even Carlos found a role, handling maintenance and repairs across all the properties. I thought they were being helpful, supportive, invested in the family they had welcomed me into. I thought we were building something together, a combined family that would support each other through anything. I had no idea they were positioning themselves for the kill. My father's illness began subtly, so subtly that we almost missed it entirely. He started forgetting small things, appointments and conversations, and where he had put his keys. At first, we attributed it to age and stress, the natural consequences of decades of hard work catching up with him. But then the forgetting got worse, and the confusion started, and one day he had a minor stroke that left him unable to speak for almost an hour. The doctors ran tests and delivered a diagnosis that shattered our world. Vascular dementia, compounded by a series of small strokes that had been occurring undetected for months or possibly years. The prognosis was not good. He would decline gradually, losing more and more of himself, until eventually there was nothing left. They gave him 1 to 3 years, depending on how his body responded to treatment. The next 2 years were the hardest of my life. I watched my father, the strongest man I had ever known, slowly disappear before my eyes. His memories faded first, decades of experiences and relationships dissolving like morning mist. Then his personality changed, the gentle patience I had known my entire life replaced by confusion and sometimes anger. He stopped recognizing me on bad days, calling me by my mother's name, or treating me like a stranger who had wandered into his room. On good days, there were flashes of the man he had been, moments of clarity that made the decline even more painful because they reminded me of everything we were losing. Marcus was wonderful during this period, or so I believed at the time. He took on more responsibility at the company, handling issues that I was too distracted to address. He coordinated with my father's doctors, managed the nursing care, and ensured that someone was always available to help with whatever was needed. His family stepped up as well, Elena visiting my father regularly, Roberto handling more of the financial matters, Miguel and Carlos taking on additional duties at the restaurants. I was grateful for all of it, too consumed by grief and exhaustion to question why they were so eager to help. I didn't realize they were using my father's illness as cover for their systematic takeover of everything he had built. Looking back, I can see the warning signs I missed during those dark months. Marcus asking unusual questions about the company's ownership structure. Elena spending time alone with my father when I wasn't there. Roberto requesting access to accounts and documents for accounting purposes. Miguel making changes to operations without consulting me first. Each incident seemed innocent in isolation, easily explained by the chaos of managing a business while caring for a dying parent. But together, they formed a pattern of manipulation and positioning that should have set off alarm bells. I was too tired, too sad, too trusting to see what was happening right in front of my face. My father's lawyer, David Chen, tried to warn me once. He called me about 6 months before my father died, asking if we could meet in person to discuss some concerns. I was in the middle of a crisis at one of the restaurants, a kitchen fire that required all my attention, and I told him I would call him back later. I never did. 2 weeks later, David had disappeared, supposedly retired and moved out of state, replaced by a new attorney I had never met. Marcus explained that my father had wanted to make a change, to work with someone who specialized in estate planning, and I accepted the explanation without question. I was too overwhelmed to dig deeper, and Marcus was counting on exactly that. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the nurses who had cared for him in his final months. I wasn't there when it happened. I had visited the night before, sitting by his bed for hours, holding his hand and talking to him even though I wasn't sure he could hear me. He had seemed peaceful, almost content, and I had gone home believing I would see him again the next day. Instead, I woke up to a phone call from the nursing home, telling me that he had passed sometime during the night. I drove there in a daze, barely able to see the road through my tears, and found his room already empty, his body taken away before I could say goodbye. The last words I had spoken to him were, "I love you, Papa. I'll see you tomorrow." At least I have that. At least my final words to him were words of love. The funeral was beautiful, a celebration of everything my father had accomplished and everyone he had touched. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, former employees and loyal customers and members of the community who remembered his generosity and kindness. I gave a eulogy that I had written through tears, talking about his journey from immigrant with nothing to successful businessman, about his devotion to my mother and to me, about the legacy he was leaving behind. Marcus stood beside me the entire time, his hand on my back, his presence steady and supportive. His family sat in the front row, Elena dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, Roberto solemn and respectful, Miguel and Carlos looking appropriately sad. They played their roles perfectly. I had no idea they were already counting their stolen fortune. Marcus was wonderful during the days that followed, handling all the arrangements, greeting mourners, making sure I didn't have to worry about anything except grieving. He answered my phone when I didn't want to talk to anyone, managed the logistics of thank you cards and flower arrangements, and held me at night when I cried myself to sleep. His family was equally supportive, bringing food to the house, helping with cleanup, constantly reassuring me that everything would be okay. I leaned on them completely, trusting them to take care of the practical matters while I processed the loss of the man who had been my entire world. That trust was the biggest mistake of my life. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral, time to allow for the initial shock of grief to fade, and for family members to travel if necessary. I expected it to be straightforward, almost ceremonial. My father's wishes had been clear for decades, stated explicitly in conversations, and documented in legal papers that had been updated regularly throughout his life. Everything went to me, his only child, with the understanding that I would continue building the legacy he had started. There were some smaller bequests to longtime employees and charities he had supported, but the bulk of the estate, the restaurants, the properties, the investments, all of it was mine. There was no ambiguity, no question about his intentions. I walked into that attorney's office expecting nothing more than a formality. The first thing that felt wrong was the attorney herself. Patricia Vance was her name, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive suit who worked for a firm I had never heard of. My father's longtime attorney, David Chen, was nowhere to be seen. When I asked about the change, Marcus smoothly explained that my father had switched lawyers a few months before his death, wanting someone with more expertise in estate planning and tax optimization. The explanation made sense on the surface, and I was too grief-stricken to push further. I just wanted to get through this proceeding so I could go home and continue mourning in peace. Patricia Vance read through the preliminary matters first, the small bequests to employees and charities, the distribution of personal effects according to my father's stated wishes. I sat there half listening, my mind wandering to memories of my father, to the life we had shared, to the future I would now have to face without him. Then she got to the main estate, and the words she spoke shattered my entire understanding of reality. According to the will Patricia read, my father had decided to leave his entire estate not to me alone, but to a newly created family trust that included me, Marcus, and Marcus's parents as equal beneficiaries. The reasoning, according to the document, was that my father wanted to ensure the business remained a family operation, and that Marcus's family, who had been so supportive during his illness, deserved to share in the rewards of their service. I was entitled to only 25% of the estate I had spent my entire life building. The remaining 75% went to my husband and his parents. I sat there, unable to breathe, unable to process what I was hearing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be my father's wish. He would never have done this. He had shown me the original will years ago. He had explained his intentions in detail, multiple times, making sure I understood exactly what I would inherit when he was gone. This document was a lie. I tried to object, my voice cracking with shock and emerging grief. There must be a mistake, I said. My father would never have done this. He told me everything went to me. He showed me the original will. This isn't right. Patricia Vance looked at me with something that might have been sympathy, but was probably just practiced patience. She had handled contested wills before, dealt with family members who couldn't accept their reduced inheritances. Mrs. Reyes, she said, using my married name in a way that suddenly felt like an insult, I understand this is difficult, but this document was properly executed, witnessed, and notarized. Your father made these changes approximately 4 months before his death, when he was still legally competent to do so. There is no mistake. I turned to Marcus, expecting him to be as shocked as I was, expecting him to demand answers or challenge this travesty of justice. Instead, I found him looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. There was sympathy in his eyes, yes, but underneath it was something else. Something cold, something satisfied. "You're grieving," he said softly, reaching for my hand. "You're confused. Your father was very sick at the end, and he made decisions you might not have known about. He wanted to make sure the family was protected, that the business would be in good hands. He did this for all of us." His words were gentle, but they felt like knives. He wasn't confused. He wasn't surprised. He had known about this all along. I looked around the room, seeing everything with new eyes. Alina, sitting with her hands folded, her face composed in an expression of dignified sadness that suddenly seemed rehearsed. Roberto, avoiding my gaze, staring at a spot on the wall like he couldn't bear to look at me. Miguel and Carlos, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware that something terrible was happening, but perhaps not fully understanding their role in it. And Patricia Vance, the attorney, watching the scene with professional detachment, knowing that she was complicit in whatever fraud had been committed, but protected by the appearance of legitimacy. They had all been in on it, every single one of them. And I had been too blind to see it coming. The weeks that followed were a nightmare of manipulation and gaslighting that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Every time I tried to question the will, Marcus would remind me that I was grieving, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that I needed to trust him and his family to handle things. He spoke to me like I was a child, or worse, like I was mentally unstable, a poor confused widow who couldn't accept the reality of her father's final wishes. His mother, Alina, called constantly, always with the same message of concern wrapped around condescension. "We're worried about you, Sophia. You seem so stressed. Maybe you should talk to someone professional." His father, Roberto, avoided me entirely, disappearing whenever I tried to corner him with questions. And Miguel and Carlos looked at me with pitying expressions that made me want to scream. I tried to fight back through official channels. I demanded to speak to my father's original attorney, David Chen, and was told he had retired and moved to Florida, leaving no forwarding information. I tried to access company accounts and discovered that my authorization had been quietly downgraded to observer status only. I went to the restaurants to check on operations and found that the managers had been instructed to report to Alina and Miguel, not to me. I hired a lawyer to contest the will and was told that the document appeared legitimate, that challenging it would be expensive and probably futile, that I should consider accepting the settlement and moving on. Every path I tried was blocked, every avenue of resistance shut down before I could make any progress. The isolation was the worst part. Marcus controlled the narrative, telling our friends and extended family that I was struggling with grief, that I had become paranoid and difficult, that everyone needed to give me space while she worked through her issues. People who had known me for years suddenly looked at me with concern and pity, asking if I was okay, suggesting therapists and support groups, treating me like a fragile thing that might shatter at any moment. My protests about the will were dismissed as symptoms of my grief, evidence that I needed help rather than signs of a legitimate injustice. I was being gaslit on a massive scale, my reality rewritten by people who had practiced their lies until they believed them themselves. The final blow came 3 months after my father's death. I came home from what I thought was a routine meeting with our accountant, a meeting that had been mysteriously canceled at the last minute, to find the locks on our house changed. My belongings were in boxes on the porch, haphazardly packed, some items missing, others damaged. Marcus was standing in the doorway of the house I had bought with my own money, the house where I had planned to raise our children, with his mother by his side, like a lieutenant supporting her general. "I'm sorry it has to be this way," he said, not sounding sorry at all, "but you've become unstable, and I need to protect myself and my family from your erratic behavior. The divorce papers are in one of those boxes. Sign them, and we can make this easy." I just stood there in the rain, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. I was being thrown out of my own home by the man who had promised to love me until death do us part. His mother was watching me with an expression of barely concealed triumph, her warm grandmother act completely abandoned now that the pretense was no longer necessary. Everything I had believed about my marriage, my family, my life, was crumbling around me like a building demolished by its own foundation. I tried to argue, to demand explanations, to assert my rights as the owner of the house and the rightful heir to my father's estate, but Marcus had prepared for this. He had documentation, forged like everything else, showing that I had transferred the house to his name months before my father's death. He had statements from doctors, obtained through manipulation of medical records, suggesting that I had a history of mental instability. He had witness statements from his family members describing my increasingly erratic behavior. None of it was true, or rather, all of it was true but stripped of context and twisted to serve his narrative. I had been emotional during my father's illness. I had sought medical help for anxiety. I had argued with family members who were secretly plotting against me. All of these things could be made to look like evidence of instability if presented by someone who knew how to manipulate the system. The divorce was brutal, a legal massacre that left me with almost nothing. Marcus had spent years preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, positioning assets, building a case that would hold up in court. His lawyers were expensive and ruthless, funded by the fortune they had already stolen from me. My lawyers were working on contingency, doing their best but outmatched at every turn. The judge looked at the evidence, saw a grief-stricken widow making wild accusations against her patient, supportive husband, and ruled accordingly. The house went to Marcus. The majority of our shared assets went to Marcus. And the will, the fraudulent will that had stripped me of 75% of my inheritance, was upheld as legitimate despite my protests. I walked out of that courthouse with nothing but my clothes, my car, and a settlement so small it felt like a deliberate insult. The $9.4 million empire my father had built, the legacy of his entire life's work, was now controlled by the family that had stolen it from me, and I was homeless, penniless, and completely alone. I spent the next 6 months in a darkness so complete that I sometimes wondered if I would ever find my way out. I moved into a cheap apartment in a bad neighborhood, the only thing I could afford with the pittance from my divorce settlement. I survived on savings that were rapidly depleting, eating cheap food and avoiding expenses wherever possible. I struggled to find the will to get out of bed each morning, seeing no point in facing days that offered nothing but reminders of everything I had lost. Some nights I thought about giving up entirely, about just disappearing and letting them have their victory, about ending the pain in ways that I'm not proud to admit I considered, but every time I came close to surrendering, something stopped me. I would think about my father, about the $20 he had started with, about the decades of hard work he had invested in building something meaningful. I would remember his voice telling me stories about the early days, about sleeping in bus stations and working 3 jobs, about refusing to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. He didn't raise a quitter, that voice would say. He raised a fighter. And somewhere in the depths of my despair, that fighting spirit began to stir. The turning point came on a night when I had hit rock bottom. I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by empty takeout containers and unpaid bills, watching the rain streak down the windows and feeling sorry for myself. I had been drinking, something I rarely did, trying to numb the pain that never seemed to fade. On the television, a news story was playing about corporate fraud, about executives who had stolen millions and been brought to justice through careful investigation and determined prosecution. I wasn't really paying attention until one phrase caught my ear. The victim refused to give up, the reporter said. She spent 2 years building her case, gathering evidence that eventually brought down an entire criminal enterprise. I looked up at the screen, seeing a woman about my age being interviewed about her experience. She had been betrayed by her business partners, had lost everything, had been written off by everyone who knew her, but she had fought back, systematically and strategically, until she had won. If she could do it, I thought, maybe I could too. Maybe it wasn't over. Maybe the story wasn't finished yet. The first thing I did was start documenting everything. I had been too shocked and grief-stricken to think clearly during the initial aftermath of my father's death, too overwhelmed by the divorce to mount any kind of effective resistance. But now I had time, and I had clarity, and I had a burning determination that grew stronger every day. I wrote down every suspicious incident I could remember, creating a timeline that stretched back years. Marcus asking unusual questions about the company's ownership structure. Elena spending time alone with my father during his illness. Roberto requesting access to financial documents for accounting purposes. Miguel making operational changes without consulting me. Patricia Vance appearing out of nowhere to replace David Chen. Every piece of the puzzle, laid out systematically so I could see the full picture of what had been done to me. I also started gathering information about my enemies. I researched Marcus's real estate business and discovered that it had been struggling for years, barely profitable, sustained by occasional windfalls that seemed to come at suspiciously convenient times. I looked into his family's finances and found a pattern of living beyond their means, of debts and expenses that didn't match their apparent income. I investigated Patricia Vance and learned that she had been disciplined by the Bar Association multiple times for ethical violations, that she had a reputation for helping wealthy clients with questionable legal matters. Everything I found confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't a spontaneous betrayal. It was a long-planned conspiracy, executed with precision by people who had done this kind of thing before. The breakthrough came when I finally tracked down David Chen, my father's original attorney. It took me 3 weeks of searching, following leads that went nowhere, hitting dead ends that seemed designed to discourage me, but I refused to give up. I called every David Chen in the state directory, searched public records for any mention of his name, even hired a skip tracer with some of my dwindling savings. Finally, I found him living in a small town in Tucson, just a few hours from Phoenix. He hadn't retired at all. He had been forced out by threats and intimidation, warned that if he spoke to anyone about my father's estate, he would face professional ruin and possibly worse. I drove to Tucson on a Saturday morning, not knowing what to expect but hoping for anything that might help me. David's house was modest, a small ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, with a garden out front that showed signs of loving attention. He answered the door with fear in his eyes, clearly expecting trouble. When I told him who I was, his face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Recognition, then guilt, then something that looked like relief. "Come in," he said. "We need to talk." What David told me over the next 3 hours confirmed everything I had suspected and revealed even more than I had imagined. Marcus had approached him almost 2 years before my father's death, asking detailed questions about the estate, the will, and how things could be restructured. David had refused to discuss confidential client matters and had warned my father about his son-in-law's suspicious interest. That's when the pressure began. Fake complaints to the Bar Association, anonymous threats to his family, a break-in at his office where several files, including my father's, were stolen. And finally, a visit from men who made it clear that his continued health depended on his cooperation. David had been terrified, and he had walked away, letting Marcus replace him with Patricia Vance, an attorney who was willing to do whatever was asked for the right price. But David had kept records. He had copies of everything, stored in a safe deposit box that he hadn't touched since leaving Phoenix, insurance in case things ever went wrong. He gave me the key, gave me the address of the bank, and apologized with tears in his eyes for not being strong enough to stop what had happened. I forgave him. He was a victim too, in his own way, terrorized by people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The important thing was that he was helping me now, giving me weapons I could use to fight back. The safe deposit box contained everything David had promised and more. There was a copy of my father's original will, the real one, which left everything to me just as he had always intended. There were medical records from the final months of my father's life, showing that he had been prescribed unusually high doses of sedatives and other medications that would have made him confused and susceptible to manipulation. There were emails and documents showing that Patricia Vance had been paid large sums of money to create the forged will and ensure it would hold up to scrutiny. And there was a handwritten letter from my father to me, dated just weeks before the new will was supposedly created, expressing his concerns about Marcus and his family and stating his intention to speak to me about protecting the estate. He had known something was wrong. He had tried to warn me, but he had been too sick, too medicated, and the letter had been intercepted before it could reach me. I sat in my car outside that bank, holding my father's letter in my hands, and I cried for the first time since the night I had been thrown out of my house. But these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of rage, of determination, of absolute certainty about what I had to do next. My father had trusted me to carry on his legacy. He had died believing that I would protect what he had built. And I had failed him, had let his enemies steal everything while I wallowed in grief and confusion. But that was over now. I had evidence, I had proof, and I was going to use them to destroy every single person who had conspired against me. But I didn't go to the authorities immediately. I had learned from my mistakes, learned that rushing into things without proper preparation only gave my enemies more opportunities to outmaneuver me. Marcus and his family had spent years planning their betrayal. They had covered their tracks carefully, building layers of protection around their crimes. If I went to the police with what I had, they would have time to create counter-narratives, to destroy additional evidence, to hire lawyers who could tie everything up in legal proceedings for years. I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to gather more evidence, build an airtight case, and then strike when they least expected it. I needed to become someone else entirely. The transformation began with my appearance. I cut my long dark hair short and dyed it blonde, a dramatic change that altered my entire look. I lost weight, 15 pounds that I couldn't really afford to lose, but that changed the shape of my face. I bought new clothes, different from anything I had worn before, and learned to carry myself differently, to move and speak in ways that wouldn't trigger recognition. I practiced in front of mirrors until even I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Sophia Reyes was disappearing. replaced by someone new, someone who had never been married to Marcus or inherited a restaurant empire or been betrayed by everyone she loved. I created a new identity for myself, using techniques I had researched online and contacts I had made in less legitimate corners of the internet. Carmen Torres, that was my new name, a woman with a fabricated history and credentials that would hold up to basic scrutiny. I got a new phone, a new email address, a new social media presence that established Carmen as a real person with a real past. I rented a different apartment under my new name, using cash from a slowly depleting reserve that I had hidden from the divorce proceedings. I was becoming a ghost, invisible to the people who had destroyed me, able to move among them without being recognized. The infiltration began 6 months after I had found David Chen. I had been watching Marcus and his family from a distance, learning their routines, identifying their weaknesses, looking for ways to get close without arousing suspicion. I discovered that Alina was now heavily involved in running the restaurants, having installed herself as the de facto head of operations, while Marcus focused on financial matters. She had fired many of the loyal employees who had known my father, replacing them with people who owed their jobs to her and would be loyal accordingly. But she was also constantly hiring, struggling to fill positions because the restaurant industry had high turnover and she wasn't a good manager. That was my opening. I applied for a job at one of the Casa Reyes locations, using my Carmen Torres identity and a carefully fabricated work history. I claimed to be a line cook with experience at several restaurants in California, providing references that would check out if anyone called. No one did. Alina was desperate for help, and I was qualified and willing to work hard. I was hired within a week and started working at a restaurant my father had built, serving food from recipes my grandmother had created, surrounded by people who had stolen everything from me. The irony was not lost on me, but it was also the perfect cover. No one expected the grieving ex-wife to show up as a line cook, and no one recognized me with my new appearance and humble demeanor. The first few weeks were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. Being in that kitchen, smelling the familiar aromas, hearing the sounds of service that had been the soundtrack of my childhood, brought back memories so vivid they were almost overwhelming. I would catch myself reaching for ingredients without thinking, moving through the space with the automatic familiarity of someone who had grown up there. I had to constantly remind myself to act like Carmen, to pretend I didn't know where everything was, to ask questions that Sophia would never have needed to ask. It was exhausting, performing a role every minute of every shift, but it was also necessary. One slip, one moment of familiarity, and everything would be ruined. I also had to deal with the changes they had made to my father's restaurants. Alina had altered recipes, substituting cheaper ingredients for the quality products my father had always insisted upon. She had reduced portion sizes, increased prices, and eliminated the small touches of hospitality that had made Casa Reyes special. The regular customers noticed, complaining about the changes, wondering what had happened to the place they had loved. But Alina dismissed their concerns, more interested in profit margins than customer satisfaction. She didn't understand what my father had always known, that the restaurant business was about more than food. It was about creating an experience, building relationships, making people feel welcome and valued. She saw only dollar signs, and she was slowly destroying the very thing she had stolen. As Carmen, I made myself indispensable. I worked hard, arrived early, stayed late, and never complained about anything. I was friendly but not too friendly, competent but not threatening, the kind of employee that managers love because they make everyone's life easier. I built relationships with the other workers, many of whom had been hired after the takeover and had no loyalty to Alina or her family. They complained to me about the changes, about the poor management, about the hostile work environment that Alina had created. I listened sympathetically, filed away everything they told me, and waited for opportunities to learn more. The breakthrough came about 4 months into my infiltration. I had built enough trust that I was occasionally asked to help with tasks beyond my normal duties, including closing procedures that gave me access to parts of the restaurant I wouldn't normally see. One night, I was helping clean the back office when I saw Alina accessing a safe that was hidden behind a filing cabinet. She was on the phone, distracted by an argument with one of her sons, and she entered the combination without checking to see if anyone was watching. I memorized it instantly, knowing that this was the opportunity I had been waiting for. Whatever was in that safe, it was important enough to hide, and that meant it was probably important enough to help me. I waited 2 weeks before making my move, wanting to be absolutely certain that no one suspected anything. I volunteered for extra shifts, made myself even more useful, and established a pattern of staying late to help with closing duties. Then on a night when I knew Alina and her family would be occupied elsewhere, I put my plan into action. I finished my regular duties, said goodbye to the other employees, and pretended to leave. Instead, I hid in a storage closet until everyone else was gone and the restaurant was silent. Then I emerged, heart pounding, and made my way to the office. The safe was exactly where I remembered it, hidden behind the filing cabinet. My hands were shaking as I entered the combination, terrified that it might have been changed, that an alarm might sound, that someone might walk in at any moment. But the combination worked, the door swung open, and inside I found a treasure trove of evidence that exceeded my wildest hopes. There were multiple copies of the forged will, some with handwritten notes in the margins showing corrections and revisions. There were bank statements from offshore accounts, showing millions of dollars that had been hidden from the IRS and from me. There were emails printed out and saved, communications between Marcus, Alina, and Patricia Vance discussing the details of their conspiracy. There were medical records showing the medications that had been given to my father, highlighting the ones that had kept him confused and compliant during the creation of the fake will. There were even recordings, audio files on USB drives that contained conversations between family members discussing their plans in explicit detail, and there was my father's letter, the original, not the copy that David had kept. Alina had taken it, had kept it hidden all these years, either as insurance or as a trophy. Reading his handwriting, feeling the paper he had touched, hearing his voice in my mind as I absorbed his words, I felt closer to him than I had since his death. He had known, he had tried to protect me, and even though he had failed, I could still honor his memory by finishing what he had started. I photographed everything, every document, every page, every piece of evidence that could help me destroy the people who had destroyed me. I replaced everything exactly as I had found it, closed the safe, moved the filing cabinet back into position, and left the restaurant as if nothing had happened. No one would know I had been there until I was ready for them to know. And by then, it would be far too late for them to stop me. The next phase of my plan required professional help. I had gathered enormous amounts of evidence, but I needed to know how to deploy it effectively, how to maximize the damage while protecting myself from any potential backlash. I needed lawyers, investigators, possibly federal authorities. I needed a team of people who could help me take down an entire criminal conspiracy without getting crushed in the process. I found Rebecca Martinez through research and reputation. She was a senior partner at a law firm that specialized in fraud cases, with a particular focus on inheritance disputes and family business conflicts. She had a reputation for taking on difficult cases, for fighting powerful defendants, and for winning even when the odds seemed impossible. I called her office, explained that I had a complex situation involving significant fraud, and asked for a consultation. When I showed her the evidence I had gathered, her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine astonishment. "This is one of the most comprehensive cases of inheritance fraud I've ever seen," she said. "And you gathered all of this yourself?" I nodded. I had to. No one else was going to do it for me. Rebecca agreed to take my case on contingency, meaning she would be paid only if we won. The evidence was strong enough that she was confident of success, and the potential recovery was large enough to make the risk worthwhile. She brought in additional resources, forensic accountants who could trace the money flows, investigators who could verify the authenticity of documents, expert witnesses who could testify about handwriting and signatures, and medical manipulation. Within a month, we had built a case that was virtually airtight, ready to be deployed whenever I gave the word. I also reached out to law enforcement. The FBI has a division that specializes in white-collar crime, and the scope of what Marcus and his family had done definitely fell within their jurisdiction. I provided them with evidence of the forgery, the embezzlement, the offshore accounts, and the cross-state financial transactions that made this a federal matter. The agents I spoke with were initially skeptical, accustomed to grieving family members making accusations that turned out to be baseless. But as they reviewed the evidence, their skepticism transformed into determination. They opened an investigation, began gathering additional proof through methods I couldn't use, and prepared for arrests that would happen at a time of my choosing. The IRS was interested as well. Marcus and his family had hidden millions of dollars in offshore accounts, failing to report income and evading taxes on an impressive scale. The tax evasion alone could result in significant prison time and financial penalties. I provided documentation of everything I had found, and the IRS began their own investigation, coordinating with the FBI to ensure that every aspect of the conspiracy would be addressed. I also contacted journalists who covered business and legal affairs in the Phoenix area. I wanted the story of what had happened to me to be told publicly, to destroy Marcus and his family's reputation as thoroughly as I was destroying their legal position. I gave background interviews, provided documentation on condition of anonymity, and helped them understand the full scope of the betrayal. They were eager to write the story, sensing a dramatic narrative that would capture public attention, but they agreed to hold off on publication until the legal proceedings were underway to avoid tipping off the targets before the trap could be sprung. Everything was ready. The evidence was gathered, the legal team was assembled, the authorities were poised to act, but I wanted one more thing before the takedown. I wanted Marcus and his family to know that they were being watched, to feel the paranoia and fear that I had experienced during those dark months after my father's death. I wanted them to suffer before they fell. I began leaving breadcrumbs, small hints that someone knew their secrets and was closing in. A copy of my father's handwritten letter, left on Marcus's car windshield where he would find it in the morning. A text message to Alina from an unknown number that simply read, "I know what you did to Antonio Reyes." A photograph of Patricia Vance sent to her office with a sticky note attached, "Your turn is coming." Each message was untraceable, delivered through methods that couldn't be connected to me, but the cumulative effect was devastating. They knew someone was after them, they just didn't know who. The paranoia tore the family apart exactly as I had hoped. Marcus accused Miguel of being the leak, convinced that his brother was trying to cut a deal with authorities. The argument that followed was violent enough that neighbors called the police, and Miguel moved out of the family home the next day. Alina became increasingly erratic, firing employees she suspected of disloyalty, changing locks and passwords, canceling credit cards and closing bank accounts in a frenzy of protective activity that only made things worse. Roberto, who had always been the quietest member of the family, retreated into complete silence, refusing to speak to anyone about anything, clearly aware that the end was coming and determined not to make things worse by talking. Carlos made the fatal mistake of trying to move money out of the offshore accounts, sensing that the assets might be seized and hoping to salvage something before it was too late. But the FBI had been monitoring those accounts for weeks, and his attempted transfer triggered alerts that gave them additional evidence of ongoing criminal activity. They now had proof not just of past crimes, but of continuing efforts to conceal and benefit from those crimes. The case against the family had become even stronger. Meanwhile, I continued working at the restaurant, watching them unravel from the inside. Alina came in less frequently now, too distracted by her personal crisis to pay attention to the business she had stolen. The quality of operations declined further, customers complained more loudly, and employees began quitting in numbers that threatened the restaurant's ability to function. Everything my father had built was crumbling, partly because of their mismanagement, and partly because I had subtly sabotaged certain systems in ways that would look like incompetence rather than sabotage. I wanted them to watch their empire fall, even before the legal hammer dropped. The takedown happened on a Wednesday morning in September, almost 2 years after my father's death. I had given the signal the night before, telling Rebecca and the FBI that I was ready for them to move. I called in sick to work, claiming a stomach bug, and positioned myself across the street from the main Casa Reyes location, where Marcus and Alina held their morning meetings. I wanted to watch. I wanted to see their faces when everything they had worked for came crashing down around them. The FBI vehicles arrived at 8:45 in the morning, 3 black SUVs that pulled up in front of the restaurant with coordinated precision. Agents emerged, wearing bulletproof vests and carrying weapons, moving with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. I watched as they entered the building, as employees inside looked up in confusion and fear, as the world Marcus and his family had constructed began to collapse in real time. Within minutes, people were being escorted out, documents were being carried away in boxes, and the restaurant was transformed into a crime scene. Marcus emerged in handcuffs at 9:15, looking smaller than I remembered, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. He had been so confident, so certain that he had gotten away with everything, that the carefully constructed lies would hold forever. Now he was being led away by federal agents while news cameras captured every moment. Alina followed shortly after, screaming about her rights, demanding to speak to her attorney, not understanding that Patricia Vance had been arrested the day before and was in no position to help anyone. Roberto was picked up at his home, quiet and resigned, seemingly relieved that the waiting was finally over. And Carlos was arrested at a coffee shop where he had been meeting with a lawyer about his own desperate situation, handcuffed in front of morning commuters who stared and took photos with their phones. Miguel was the last to fall. He had separated from the family after the violent argument with Marcus, and he had been trying to distance himself from their crimes ever since. but the evidence showed that he had been involved from the beginning, had participated in the conspiracy, had benefited from the stolen fortune. He was arrested at his apartment later that afternoon, crying and claiming that he had been coerced, that he had never wanted to hurt anyone, but his tears meant nothing to the agents who led him away. He had made his choices, and now he would live with the consequences. The arrests made national news. The story of a grieving daughter betrayed by her husband and his entire family, fighting back to reclaim her father's legacy, captured the public imagination in a way that few legal cases ever do. Journalists who had been waiting for the go-ahead published their stories, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy in devastating detail. Social media exploded with commentary, most of it sympathetic to me and hostile to Marcus and his family. The hashtag Justice for Antonio trended for 3 days, a tribute to the man whose legacy had been stolen and was now being reclaimed. I gave interviews, carefully managed by Rebecca and her team, telling my story in my own words for the first time. I talked about my father, about his journey from immigrant with nothing to successful businessman. I talked about the betrayal, about the forged will and the stolen inheritance and the years of manipulation. I talked about the months I had spent homeless and desperate, about the transformation into Carmen Tours, about the infiltration that had given me the evidence I needed. I was no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be someone else. I was Sophia Reyes, daughter of Antonio Reyes, and I was taking back what was mine. The legal proceedings lasted over a year, a complex web of criminal and civil cases that required the attention of multiple courts and dozens of lawyers. Marcus was charged with fraud, forgery, embezzlement, conspiracy, and elder abuse, facing a maximum sentence of 35 years if convicted on all counts. Elena faced similar charges, as did Patricia Vance. Roberto and Carlos faced lesser charges for their supporting roles in the conspiracy. And Miguel, despite his protests of coercion, was charged as a full participant in the crimes. The trials were everything I had hoped for and more. Witness after witness testified to the conspiracy, providing details that painted a devastating picture of calculated betrayal. David Chen described how he had been threatened and forced out. Medical experts explained how the medications given to my father would have impaired his judgment. Handwriting analysts confirmed that the signature on the forged will did not match my father's genuine writing. Financial investigators traced the money flows, showing exactly how the stolen fortune had been hidden and spent. And I testified about my father, about our relationship, about the promises he had made and the legacy he had wanted to leave. I testified about the betrayal, about losing everything, about the months of homelessness and despair. And I testified about my revenge, about the transformation and infiltration, about the evidence I had gathered and the justice I had sought. Marcus tried to negotiate a plea deal, offering to testify against his family in exchange for a reduced sentence. But I made it clear to the prosecutors that I wanted maximum accountability, no deals, no reduced sentences, no escape routes. He had orchestrated the destruction of my life, and he would pay the full price. The prosecutors agreed, and Marcus was forced to go to trial, facing evidence that his lawyers couldn't explain away no matter how hard they tried. His defense tried to paint me as the unstable ex-wife seeking revenge, but the evidence contradicted everything he claimed. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The sentences were everything I had hoped for. Marcus received 22 years in federal prison, the maximum possible for his crimes. Elena received 18 years. Patricia Vance got 12 years and was permanently disbarred. Roberto received 10 years for his role as the family's financial manager, the person who had handled the offshore accounts and hidden the stolen money. Carlos got 8 years for his participation in the conspiracy. And Miguel, despite his tears and his claims of coercion, received 12 years for his full involvement in destroying my life. The total prison time for the family exceeded 70 years. Every single one of them would spend a decade or more behind bars. And the civil lawsuit that Rebecca had filed resulted in a judgment of $14.2 million, including the original estate value, plus punitive damages, interest, and compensation for the emotional distress I had suffered. The family's assets were seized to satisfy the judgment, and I received every penny that was owed to me. The empire my father had built was mine again, legitimately and permanently. The first thing I did when I regained control of Casa Reyes was restore it to what it had been before the theft. I rehired every employee who had been wrongfully terminated by Elena and her family. I restored the original recipes, the quality ingredients, the generous portions, and the atmosphere of hospitality that my father had always insisted upon. I commissioned new portraits of my grandmother to hang in every location, larger and more prominent than before. And I changed the name of the company to Casa Antonio, honoring my father directly and making it clear that his legacy would never again be threatened by anyone who didn't share his blood and his values. The business recovered faster than I had dared to hope. Customers who had noticed the decline during Alina's management returned in droves when they heard the news, eager to support the rightful owner and taste the authentic flavors they remembered. Employees who had survived the dark years recommitted themselves to excellence, grateful to be working for someone who valued their contributions. Within 2 years, Casa Antonio had expanded to 12 locations, with revenue exceeding $15 million annually. My father's dream had not only survived but thrived, and I had proven myself worthy of the legacy he had left me. I think about Marcus sometimes, rotting in his prison cell, and I feel nothing but cold satisfaction. He had everything handed to him. A loving wife, a successful business, a family that welcomed him without reservation. And instead of appreciating what he had, he chose to destroy it all in pursuit of money he hadn't earned. He gambled on my weakness and lost. He underestimated my resilience and paid the price. Every day he spends in that cell is a reminder that betrayal has consequences, that karma may be slow but it is certain, and that the people you hurt the most are often the ones who will bring you down. Alina writes to me occasionally from prison, letters full of excuses and requests for forgiveness that I throw away unopened. She claims she was manipulated by Marcus, that she didn't understand what she was participating in, that she deserves a second chance. But I read the emails she wrote, I heard the recordings of her conversations. I know exactly how eagerly she participated in the scheme to steal everything from me. She was a willing conspirator, a woman who pretended to love me while systematically destroying my life. She doesn't deserve forgiveness, and she will never receive it from me. I got married again 2 years after the trials ended, to a man named Daniel who I met through the restaurant business. He's a chef trained at the Culinary Institute of America, who came to work at one of my locations and immediately impressed me with his talent and integrity. He knows my whole story, every detail of the betrayal and the revenge, and he loves me not despite what I did but because of it. He says my strength inspires him, that my resilience makes him want to be better, that my story proves that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. We're expecting our first child in 4 months, a daughter who we plan to name Catalina after my grandmother. The cycle of loss and betrayal has been broken, and a new cycle of love and legacy has begun. I visit my father's grave often, especially on important occasions, telling him about everything that has happened since his death. I tell him about the trials, about the convictions, about the judgment that restored his empire to me. I tell him about Daniel, about the baby, about the future I'm building on the foundation he created. I tell him about the restaurant expansion, the new locations, the customers who still remember him and tell stories about his hospitality. And I tell him I'm sorry I didn't see the danger sooner, sorry I let his final months be manipulated by people who didn't deserve to be in his presence. But I also tell him I'm proud that I didn't let them win, proud that I fought back, proud that I honored his memory by refusing to surrender. The wind rustles through the trees when I talk to him, and I like to believe it's his way of telling me he's proud too. The restaurant empire continues to grow, and I've started thinking about what comes next. I want to open a culinary school for underprivileged youth, giving them the same opportunities my father found when he arrived in this country with nothing. I want to create a foundation that supports immigrant entrepreneurs, helping them navigate the challenges he faced and avoid the predators who would try to take advantage of them. I want his legacy to extend beyond food and business, to become something that transforms lives and creates opportunities for generations to come. He came here with $20 and a dream, and I want to help others achieve their own dreams using the resources he worked so hard to create. The lesson I learned from this experience is simple but profound. Trust must be earned, not given. I trusted Marcus because he was charming and kind and supportive, but I never verified that his character matched his words. I trusted his family because they were welcoming and warm, but I never questioned whether their warmth was genuine or calculated. I assumed that people who claimed to love me actually loved me, that family meant loyalty, that marriage meant partnership. I was wrong about all of it. The people closest to you are often the ones best positioned to destroy you, and the only protection is vigilance, independence, and the willingness to fight back when necessary. I'm not the same person I was before the betrayal. That Sophia, the trusting wife and grieving daughter, died in the rain outside her own house when Marcus changed the locks. The Sophia who exists now is harder, sharper, more suspicious of intentions, and more protective of boundaries. Some people might see that as a loss, a sacrifice of innocence in the name of survival, but I see it as growth. I became who I needed to be to survive, and that person is stronger and more capable than the one who came before. The betrayal broke me, but I rebuilt myself into something better. Daniel sometimes asks if I have any regrets about how I handled things, if I ever wonder whether the revenge was worth it, whether I could have found peace without destroying them so completely. I always tell him the same thing. They took everything from me. My father's legacy, my home, my identity, my faith in humanity. If I had let them keep it, if I had walked away and tried to start fresh somewhere else, the injustice would have eaten me alive. I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what I could have done differently, hating myself for being too weak to fight back. The revenge wasn't about hatred or cruelty. It was about justice, about accountability, about proving to myself that I was worth fighting for. And it was absolutely, unquestionably worth it. The story of Casa Antonio is still being written. Every day, we serve thousands of customers who taste my father's recipes and experience his vision of hospitality. Every day, we create opportunities for employees who become part of our family, treated with the respect and dignity my father always insisted upon. Every day, we honor the legacy of a man who came from nothing and built something extraordinary. And every day, I wake up grateful that I didn't let that legacy be stolen by people who saw it only as a source of money and power. They saw the dollar signs. I see the dream. That's the difference between us, and that's why I won. My name is Sophia Reyes. My father was Antonio Reyes. Together, we built an empire that survived betrayal, fraud, and the worst that human nature has to offer. I lost everything and got it back, plus interest. I watched my enemies go to prison while I reclaimed what was rightfully mine. And now I'm building a future that honors the past while creating something new for my daughter and her children after her. That's my revenge. Not the arrests or the judgments or the media coverage, but the life I'm living now, filled with love and purpose and the satisfaction of knowing that I won. Some people say that revenge is a dish best served cold. I disagree. Revenge is a dish best served completely, with every detail attended to, every injustice addressed, every wrong made right. It took me 2 years to build my case, 18 months of living undercover, countless hours of gathering evidence and planning strategy. But when I finally struck, I struck with overwhelming force, leaving nothing to chance, ensuring that every single person who had participated in my destruction would face appropriate consequences. That's not cold, that's thorough, that's professional, that's exactly what they deserved. The last time I saw Marcus was at his sentencing hearing. He looked older than his years, diminished by months of legal battles and the reality of what awaited him. He tried to make eye contact with me, maybe hoping for some sign of forgiveness or understanding, some acknowledgement of the life we had once shared. But I looked through him like he was made of glass. He wasn't my husband anymore. He wasn't even my enemy anymore. He was just a criminal who had been caught, a con man whose luck had finally run out. He didn't deserve my attention, my emotion, or my energy. He had taken enough from me already. Vanessa was different. I felt something for her, though I'm not entirely sure what. She had been foolish rather than malicious, swept up in a scheme orchestrated by her children without fully understanding the consequences. Or maybe she had understood perfectly and had simply been too greedy to care. Either way, she was facing 18 years in prison, and whatever sympathy I might have felt was overwhelmed by my memories of her triumph on the day I was thrown out of my house. She had smiled at me through the window, a smile of pure satisfaction, of victory over an enemy who had never known she was in a battle. That smile had haunted me through months of homelessness and despair. Now it would haunt her through years of incarceration. I built a memorial to my father in the original Casa Reyes location, the tiny taqueria where his dream had begun. It's a wall of photographs and documents, showing his journey from immigrant with nothing to successful businessman. There's a photo of him arriving in Phoenix in 1978, young and hopeful and completely unaware of the challenges ahead. There's a photo of him and my mother on their wedding day, their faces shining with love and optimism. There's a photo of him holding me as a baby, his expression one of pure joy. And there's a photo from the grand opening of the original restaurant, my father standing proudly in front of his creation, his whole future stretching out before him. Customers stop at this memorial, read the story, and sometimes they cry. They understand what he built and what almost happened to it, and they understand what I did to save it. I've started writing a book about my experience, partly as therapy and partly to help others who might be going through something similar. The book will tell the full story of the betrayal and the revenge, with all the details that I couldn't include in interviews or court testimony. It will explain how I gathered evidence, built my case, and ultimately destroyed the people who tried to destroy me. But more importantly, it will explain the emotional journey, the despair and the rage and the determination that carried me through the darkest period of my life. I want people to know that recovery is possible, that justice is achievable, that even the most devastating betrayal can be overcome by someone who refuses to give up. The book will also serve as a warning. There are predators everywhere, people who look for vulnerable targets and plot elaborate schemes to separate them from their money and their dignity. They can be strangers, but more often they're people we trust, people we love, people we would never suspect of harboring such darkness. My message to readers will be simple: be careful who you trust, verify everything, never assume that someone's intentions match their words, and if you are betrayed, if someone does manage to hurt you despite your precautions, know that you have options, know that you can fight back. Know that justice is possible, even when everything seems hopeless. The culinary school I've been planning will open next year, in a building that used to be one of Alina's failed side projects. It will offer free training to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, teaching them the skills they need to succeed in the restaurant industry. The curriculum will include not just cooking techniques but business fundamentals, helping graduates understand how to manage money, negotiate contracts, and protect themselves from exploitation. My father never had access to formal education, and he succeeded anyway through sheer determination. I want to give others the tools that might have made his journey easier, the knowledge that can help them avoid the pitfalls he encountered. The foundation I'm establishing will support immigrant entrepreneurs in multiple ways. We'll provide small business loans with favorable terms, mentorship from successful business owners, and legal assistance to navigate the complexities of starting a company in America. We'll also maintain a database of predatory actors, people and companies known to take advantage of vulnerable entrepreneurs, helping our members avoid the kind of exploitation my father experienced in his early years. The foundation will carry my father's name and honor his memory by continuing the work he started, helping others achieve the American dream he fought so hard to realize. Daniel and I have bought a house in a quiet neighborhood, close enough to the restaurants that I can check in regularly, but far enough that we can have a private life separate from the business. The house has a big backyard where our daughter will play, a kitchen where we cook together, and a nursery that we've decorated with images from my father's homeland. When Catalina is old enough to understand, I'll tell her about her grandfather, about his journey, about what happened after his death, and about what I did to save his legacy. I want her to know that she comes from strong people, fighters who never gave up, and I want that knowledge to give her strength when she faces her own challenges. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what my life would have been like if I had never met Marcus, if I had married someone honest and kind, if my father's death had been followed by normal grief rather than catastrophic betrayal. Would I be happier? Would I be the same person I am now? I don't think so. The betrayal changed me in fundamental ways, forcing me to discover strengths I never knew I had, pushing me to become someone capable of things I never imagined. I wouldn't choose to go through it again, but I also can't deny that it shaped me into the woman I am today, a woman I'm proud to be. The sun is setting over Phoenix as I finish writing this story, casting golden light over the city where my father built his dream, and where I reclaimed it from the people who tried to steal it. Somewhere in this city, in federal prisons scattered across the Southwest, Marcus and his family are living out the consequences of their choices. They will be there for many years, aging behind bars while I build a future they tried to steal. Somewhere else, customers are enjoying meals at Casa Antonio, tasting recipes that have been passed down through 3 generations, experiencing the hospitality that my father believed in so deeply. And somewhere in this house, my husband is preparing dinner, our daughter is kicking inside me, and a life I never thought I would have is unfolding with every passing moment. I don't think about Marcus and his family much anymore. They're part of my past, a chapter that has been written and closed, a lesson that has been learned and internalized. My future is what matters now, the future I'm building with Daniel, the future I'm creating for my daughter, the future that honors my father's memory while adding new chapters to his story. That's my revenge, not the prison sentences or the judgments or the media coverage, but this life, this happiness, this absolute refusal to let the worst thing that ever happened to me define who I am. My name is Sophia Reyes. I was betrayed by everyone I loved, lost everything I had, and spent 18 months as a ghost, gathering evidence and planning destruction. I watched my enemies go to prison. I took back everything they stole. And now I'm living a life that's richer, fuller, and more meaningful than anything I had before the betrayal. That's my story, that's my victory, and that's the ending they never saw coming. This is my story. It doesn't end with the revenge, because revenge is just a chapter, not the whole book. It ends with redemption, with the restoration of something that was almost lost forever, with the proof that justice is possible even when everything seems hopeless. I hope my story inspires others who have been betrayed, who have lost everything, who are wondering whether it's worth fighting back. It is. It absolutely is. Don't let them win. Don't let them keep what they stole. Don't let their victory become permanent. Fight back with everything you have, and don't stop until you've taken back what's yours. That's what my father would have wanted. That's what I did. And that's what you can do too. Tomorrow, I will go to work at Casa Antonio. I will walk through the restaurants my father built, greet the employees he would have loved, and ensure that every customer receives the experience he always envisioned. Then I will go home to Daniel, feel our daughter kick in my belly, and be grateful for every moment of this life that I almost lost. And the next day I will do it all again, because that's what my father taught me. You don't build an empire in a day. You build it meal by meal, customer by customer, day by day, with persistence and pride and the determination to never give up no matter how hard things get. That's his legacy, and now it's mine. I am Sophia Reyes, daughter of Antonio, wife of Daniel, mother of the child growing inside me, owner of Casa Antonio and heir to a dream that started with $20 and a heart full of hope. I was betrayed by the people I trusted most, lost everything I had, and spent 18 months rebuilding from nothing while plotting the destruction of those who destroyed me. I succeeded, they failed, and justice, however long it took, was finally served. This is my story. And I wouldn't change a single word of it.